All right, everyone. Hello. Thank you so much for joining the first virtual lecture hosted by Airwoods Indoors. At Airwoods Indoors, our mission is to share, inspire, and enhance the knowledge of windowsill airwood enthusiasts and to bridge the gap to the scientific community. Each lecture in our series focuses on a topic relevant to the care of Airwoods Indoors. This week, we are happy to welcome Chelsea McKinley, plant health specialist from the United States Botanic Gardens. Chelsea will be teaching us about our nemesis of every plant collector, thrips. My name is Georgia Wilson, and I host these lectures alongside our moderators, Ryan McGee and Becca Israel. We thank everyone for joining. We do ask that all listeners please mute your microphone. We'll be open for questions after the lecture, but please feel free to type in your questions at any point. This lecture is being recorded and will be free to listen to after this event. Open it to you now, Chelsea.
All right, let me switch over to my presentation without giving away too much. All right, can you guys see my screen? All right, so, I started a little too early. Forgive me. Okay, so as you know, we are here today to talk about thrips. And I'm excited to tell you all about how to identify them, their life cycle, and some control measures. So as Georgia introduced me, I'm Chelsea McKinley. I'm the plant health specialist at the United States Botanic Garden. So I battle thrips on a daily basis. They're also one of my nemesis, many nemesises. So there are over or around 5,000 species of thrips. It's a lot of freaking thrips. So I'm not going to cover all of them today. And so I say around 5,000 because just like in plant taxonomy, there are lumpers and splitters. So some people who lump certain thrips together into one species and others who think that they should be separate species. The singular and plural form is thrips. So you would say a thrips or those thrips. I know it sounds really weird, but once you start saying it, you kind of get used to it. So if you want to sound smart, or especially if you're talking to someone who knows a lot about insects, it's good to know how to properly use terminology. Today we'll be covering Western flower thrips, onion thrips, chili thrips, and echinothrips. These are thrips that I commonly see in our greenhouses. So I figure you guys will probably also encounter, especially those of you in the United States. I apologize if this doesn't translate across the seas, but with how international plant trade is now, I'm sure that you know, a lot of these species are kind of spread around the globe, especially as plants get mailed and shipped to different areas. Most of the thrips that we're going to be talking about today are between 0.5 millimeter to 1.5 millimeters. So they are very, very tiny and sometimes difficult to see, but we'll touch on that a little bit. The ones we'll be talking about are plant feeders. And most thrip species do feed on plants. There are some that also feed on fungal spores, and there are a few that are predaceous. So they actually will hunt other insect species. So like this black hunter thrips right here. This is Aleothrips, and many of the predaceous thrip species have these horizontal bandings to them. So they have these horizontal stripes. So that's one way to really tell a difference between one of these awesome species versus a plant pest. And the hunter thrips will actually feed on other thrip species that are feeding on your plants. So they're good to have around, but the other ones that are eating your plants, not so much. And one of the reasons why thrips aren't good to have around, at least the plant feeding type, is because they also transmit plant viruses. So that's no good. And we'll go a little bit more in depth on the plant viruses that could potentially affect your plant collections, particularly tomato spotted wilt virus and impatiens necrotic spot virus. Thrips also feed on pollen, so they can inadvertently be pollinators. Over here, you can see a picture of a thrips on a orchid stigma, and it's kind of got some pollen on it. So yeah, despite the fact that, you know, they can be bad for our plants, they can also pollinate plants and cause them to go to seed as well. So they aren't all bad. And the species that we're going to talk about today also have very broad host ranges, which is one of the reasons why I wanted to talk about them, because they tend to be the most prevalent of the thrips pests. All right, so first off, Western flower thrips, Franklinia occidentalis, as nerdy scientists like to say. They are around 1.5 millimeters, and that is for the female adults. So typically, thrips populations tend to have more females than males, just the way genetics work and everything, and they're actually able to reproduce asexually, which makes them really terrible plant pests. Other plant pests can also do that, like aphids and mealybugs and things like that, so they don't need to mate in order to reproduce. They just start laying eggs or giving birth to live young, like with aphids. So it really kind of shortens their lifespan to some degree and allows for more generations to happen, which makes them a plant pest. Western flower thrips takes them between 5 and 45 days to go from an egg to adults. And that's a very, very broad range because they are adapted to live in kind of a broad climatic range as well. So because they aren't warm-blooded, their life cycle is dependent upon the climate that they're in. And since life is nothing but a series of chemical reactions, and chemical reactions happen faster at warmer temperatures, thrips lifespans are shorter when it's warmer out, if that makes any sense. Western flower thrips look very similar to onion thrips, which is why I have them on the same slide. So this thrips right here on the right is a Western flower thrips, and this one here on the left is an onion thrips. Onion thrips are a little bit smaller, and they're also a little more uniform in their coloration. And the best ways to tell them apart, and you're going to need a hand lens for this, like a very powerful hand lens, is they have these three little ocelli, and they're kind of like eyes to some degree. It's a part of an insect that absorbs light and allows them to know what time of day it is, and also the day length and all that stuff. So these little three ocelli appear in between their eyes. On Western flower thrips, they are red. On onion thrips, they are pale. Western flower thrips also have a black tip to their abdomen, and onion thrips don't. They're just a little more neutral colored. Western flower thrips tend to be resistant to spinosad, which is a common insecticide used to treat thrips. So this is one of the reasons why it's good to know what species of thrips you have, because one insecticide might not work on one species, but it works on other species. So there are certain populations of Western flower thrips that have developed a resistance to spinosad because of overuse, especially in the nursery trade. You know, growers spraying spinosad over and over again, they develop resistance. Spinosad still work on other types of thrips because other thrips might not be as common in certain areas where spinosids have been used. Western flower thrips and onion thrips have both been known to transmit plant viruses. And both of these species are native to the United States. So they're just around, hanging out, you know, hanging out in your flowers and your weeds in your garden, which makes them more prevalent to some indoor gardening enthusiasts because they might come inside on your clothes or with a nice breeze. Onion thrips, they go a little bit faster in their life cycle. So about 20 days egg to adult. They also lay a lot more eggs, so they might proliferate a little bit quicker. So you might see heavier populations of these. Onion thrips also prefer to hang out on leaves of plants, whereas Western flower thrips prefer the flowers of plants. Not saying that you won't find one in either place or the other, but just their general habitats. And for onion thrips, each adult will lay on average 37 eggs, but they can lay up to 200 eggs. And I'll go a little bit more in depth in their life cycle, but so for adults live around 35 days. And that's pretty consistent across most pest thrip species in terms of they live around a month. So between 20 and 40 days, and again, that depends on the temperature and all that. But so you have an adult thrips laying eggs for at least, you know, a good portion of that time that they're alive. So they're laying multiple generations. And that's one of the reasons why it can make them really difficult to control, because, you know, you might kill off one generation of, you know, one generation that they produce, but they might lay eggs and produce a second generation. All right. And moving on, we have chili thrips. They are teeny tiny, super small. Over here is a picture of Western flower thrips and a chili thrips. The adults tend to be under 1 millimeter long, so they're very hard to see. And in addition to being very tiny, they like to hang out in the apical meristem of plants, so in the buds of plants. And it's really difficult unless you start dissecting the buds, which you don't want to do because it can harm your plants, to find them. You can typically tell that they're there because of the distorted new growth of a plant. So you might not see them present, but then your plant is putting out new growth and those leaves come out very distorted and curled, maybe kind of cupped. These are invasive, so they originally came from Southeast Asia. And we also have echinothrips, so Echinothrips americanus. And they are about the size of Western flower thrips, but their bodies are black, so it makes them a little bit easier to identify from some of the other species. There are other black thrip species, so, but one of the ways you can tell this species apart from the other black species is that the other black species tend to have a really long or longer ovipositor. So it's just kind of like the tip of their abdomen kind of will stick out a little bit more, whereas Echinothrips doesn't. Their wings just kind of cover the tip of their abdomen. And they are native to the eastern United States, so it's another species. So just amongst these 4 species, 3 of them are native to the United States. So they're just outside hanging out, having a good time until they get to come in and feed on your plants. If you really want to get into the nitty-gritty in terms of identification, there are a lot of great keys out there, and I apologize. For some reason, this link isn't showing up, but I will take you to it. So this is greenhouseipm.org/pests/thrips key. And this is a really great key for, you know, those of you that might not be as familiar with terminology and whatnot. You probably need a microscope to get through most of these keys, unfortunately. But if you do have a microscope around and you're bored and you want to try to identify some thrips, this is a great key. I wanted to show you some pictures of what thrips damage looks like so that you'll be able to identify it when you see it on your plants at home. So this is a Morphophallus crucianus. And I had scouted this plant, had seen thrips on it earlier this year. And so I know that this is foliage that had expanded after thrips had fed on it. And so what happens is, the thrips are feeding on it when it's really young. It's damaging all these cells, and then when the plant tries to expand and continue growing that leaf, all those cells that got damaged when the leaf was really young, whether it's in, the bud or right after it emerged, they aren't able to expand properly, or they're dead, so the leaf just kind of distorts and possibly has some holes. So the thrips didn't actually chew these holes into the leaves. It's just the damage that from when the leaf was expanding. So it maybe started out as a teeny tiny hole, and then as the leaf expanded, it got larger. Here we have some really classic thrips feeding damage on a poinsettia leaf, right here. So notice the scarring and the distortion. And then over here we have chili thrips damage on a cotton leaf. And so you can see the kind of cupping. And here we have more chili thrips damage on a pittosporum. Notice the silvering of the leaves and the distorted new growth. So some people confuse thrips damage with spider mite damage. Spider mite damage, I'll skip forward. So this is a heliconia. And so this is spider mite damage, and it's much more, it looks more dusty. I can't figure out a better way to explain it. And it's also a little bit more even to some degree. It looks more like somebody's airbrushed the damage on. Whereas with thrips damage, it looks a little bit more like splatter paint to some degree. So you get these blotchy silvering patches. This is very much a close-up of Western flower thrips feeding. And you can see the frass too. So this is just insect poop on the leaf. And not all thrips will leave this very noticeable frass spotting on the leaves, but this is very classic of Western flower thrips. But just because you don't see the frass doesn't mean that you don't have thrips. But if you do see the frass, then that is a good identification. And then over here, I just want to pull a picture of another Araceae plant that also had damage on it. This flower has some thrips feeding damage on the outside of the staff, heliconium. All right, so disease. For those of you that aren't familiar, plants can get diseases just like humans can, including viruses. Unfortunately, viruses in plants, there is no cure. Once your plant gets a virus, that's pretty much it, and you should probably get rid of it so it doesn't spread to your other plants. There are test strips out there. If your plant is exhibiting suspicious signs or symptoms of a virus, you can get test kits for checking for various viruses like impatient necrotic spot virus or tomato spotted wilt virus. And both of these viruses have been known to infect plants in the Araceae family. And so some of the classic symptoms are stunted growth or dieback of terminal tips, bronzing leaves, black streaks on the petioles or stems. And oftentimes with viruses, you'll also get these really defined lines of where the virus is, and you kind of get like concentric circles or spotting and things like that. And it doesn't necessarily get soft or mushy like with, say, a bacteria or a fungus, you know, just kind of like dries up and just kind of is sporadically throughout the plant presented. But yeah, test kits tend to be the best way to really positively identify these. But do keep in mind that, you know, there are many viruses out there and you can't test for all of them. So even if your plant tests negative, it could still potentially have some other random virus. The best thing that you can do to prevent viruses in your plants is just, you know, staying on top of any pest outbreaks, and also sanitizing your hands and your pruners in between your plants. Because this, just like a bloodborne pathogen in humans, can be transmitted through sap. So you really want to practice good sanitation to keep your plants healthy and happy. All right, their life cycle. I know some of you are excited to learn about this. So we'll start with the egg stage, because, you know, we start with the chicken or the egg. Let's start with egg. They are deposited inside of the plant tissue, which is one of the reasons why thrips can be so difficult to control. You can't spray the eggs. They're just hanging out in the tissue until they hatch. Then you have the first instar larva. It's hanging out on the leaf, teeny tiny, usually very pale color. And then they transform into the second instar larva, also feeding on the leaf surface or in the flower. And these phases are fairly easy to control. So these are the best stages to try to spray. These are also the stages that are most susceptible to a lot of predaceous insects if you're using biological insects. And then the second instar larva pupates into the propupa and the pupa, so the pupal stages. So these actually the insect doesn't just like move down into the soil. What happens is that it pupates on the leaf surface, and it doesn't really attach itself by any means to the leaf surface, so it just then kind of falls off of the plant at some point into the soil. So there are potentially still pupa just hanging out on your plant, but most of them end up falling off of the plant into the soil or the ground surrounding the plant. And so these stages can be difficult to control, but if you're knowledgeable of their existence, then, you know, you can address them. And then the pupate metamorphizes into the adult and pops out and either crawls back up onto the plant and continues feeding and laying eggs, or it raises up its little weird fringed wings and drifts off on a nice breeze somewhere else. And yeah, I mentioned before, populations tend to be biased towards females. And these propupa and pupa stages will overwinter in the soil. So they, like a lot of insects and animals and plants and everything, they also kind of go dormant during the winter months, which is why you might not see them as much. Although, like, if you do have a really warm home environment, or, you know, you have a terrarium or something like that, they may continue living through the winter months and repopulating. And as I also mentioned before, just keeping in mind that chili thrips complete their entire life cycle on the plant. So, you know, you don't really need to address the soil dwelling phases if you're pretty certain you have chili thrips. And thrips tend to be most active spring through the fall outdoors. So this is likely when you'll see them on your plants, because they'll come in on your clothes, or on a breeze. Which brings me to cultural controls. Some of you who are avid indoor gardeners might be also avid outdoor gardeners. So I highly recommend that if you are gardening outdoors and you're getting all up in your plants, that you decontaminate when you come inside. So I included this fun little decontamination poster from the CDC. Thrips aren't radioactive by any means, I'm not trying to say that, but the general rules of decontamination apply. So, you know, take off your clothes, take a shower, you know, clean yourself well, and you're going to be less likely to have any hitchhikers spread to your indoor plants. If you're just walking around outside, it's probably unlikely you're really going to be bringing stuff in, unless you're wearing yellow. Thrips are very attracted to yellow, so if you have like a favorite yellow shirt or something, then maybe take it off when you come inside. And so for highly infested plants, you may want to change the soil because of those pupal stages that hang out in the soil. It might just be easier to just completely wash all the soil off of the roots and, you know, put the plant in some sterile media. It's also important to know that stressed plants are more susceptible to disease and pests. I'm not saying that healthy plants are completely impervious to disease and plants, but stressed plants are definitely more likely to be infected or infested. So just making sure that you know what the optimal growing conditions are for your plant species and that you're providing that to them, and they'll be more likely to at least be able to combat any diseases or pathogens or pests that they come in contact with. It's also important to scout your plants, especially when you get new plants into your collection, because that's when, you know, you could be bringing in a lot of potential diseases and pathogens and pests. So when you get a new plant in, you know, unpack it away from your other plants and take a close look at it. If you have a hand lens or a magnifying visor, I like using this magnifying visor at work. Makes me look really nerdy, but it's also super nice to use. Just take a really good close look at it, you know, look down in the leaf petioles, on the undersides of the leaves, take a look at the roots, all that fun stuff. And if the plant does have any pests, then treat it before you introduce it to the rest of your plant collection. Also, just scouting your plants on a regular basis. You know, if you have a hand lens and you're watering them, it's good to kind of take a look at them, check them out, flip over their leaves, take a look at them, because the earlier you catch pests, the easier they are going to be to treat. You know, it's when there's an outbreak, it's not too late, but it's definitely much more difficult to control. I just kind of threw this in here, sticky cards with pheromone lures. This is something that we do use in greenhouses. I don't really know of any indoor gardening folks, home growers that use sticky cards, but there's no reason why you can't. I mean, these are things you can get from a lot of different companies. And if you throw a pheromone lure on there with a sticky card, that will severely attract any thrips that might be in the general vicinity. So it could not only be used as a way of, you know, scouting your crop and seeing whether or not there are thrips in your house, but also as a means of control, because you'll be attracting all of those adults to the sticky card where they'll get stuck and they won't be able to lay eggs anymore. Yellow sticky cards work better at attracting thrips than blue sticky cards do, but it's easier to see the thrips on blue sticky cards. So just something to keep in mind depending on what you're trying to accomplish. Beneficials and biocontrol options. I love this stuff. I do a lot of it with my current job. Some of this might be difficult for you home growing folks, especially in air-conditioned, low relative humidity environments. So first off, I'll mention nematodes. Steinernema feltiae is one of the most common ones out there that you can buy commercially. And they kind of provide varied results to some degree. So they attack the pupa in the soil. And so they're great for that stage. And I think that they're great in combination with other treatment methods. If you do have a consistent thrips population, I would definitely recommend getting some of these and just doing, so what you do is you mix them with water and then you water them onto your plants so they just kind of hang out in the soil and they just kind of lie in wait until a thrips pupa comes along their way and then they attack. They're pretty cool. They are sensitive to UV light, so, you know, like with all of the biological control options, they are living organisms. They need to have the proper conditions, otherwise they might die. So make sure that, you know, you are providing them the optimal conditions and, you know, maybe do a little bit of research on what those are before spending the money on these things, because you want to make sure you aren't just killing them before you are even able to get them onto your plants. So like with Steinernema feltiae, they are sensitive to UV light, they require moist conditions, they need to be kept refrigerated until used, but once they get used, they're safe around pets and kids. You know, you could probably eat the stuff and you'll be fine. They are very specific in what they attack. I'm not recommending eating it. Don't eat nematodes. There are some pretty cool biopesticides out there nowadays. There are various companies that are manufacturing these products that are either fungal spores or bacterium, and turning them into a pesticide. So I like using these because there isn't the concern around resistance, or having these pests build resistance like there would be with a lot of the chemical pesticides. They also tend to have lower toxicity overall towards humans. The only big concern with them is developing an allergy to them. So you do have to wear some PPE when you're actively handling and spraying them if that's something you choose to do. They also tend to only work best under like really warm, humid conditions. So say you bring your plants outside and you live in kind of a tropical area for the summer months, that's maybe a potential pesticide you could spray on them outside when it's warm and humid. Or if you have a terrarium or something like that, this might be a potential possibility. But if your plants are just hanging out in your air-conditioned apartment, this stuff probably won't work. Something that would work in an air-conditioned apartment could potentially be predatory mites. So there's Amblyseius cucumerus is the most common predatory mite on the market, and they specifically feed on thrips. So they feed on the larval stages, so the smaller stages of the thrips, and they just kind of like crawl around and like nom on whatever thrips they come in contact with. And I just want to make sure I mention everything. And they're also safe around kids and pets too. They're pretty great. I did want to mention this little bug. This is a true bug. This is Aureus insidious. It's a minute pirate bug. They are wonderful on thrips, especially during the summer months. Probably not so great in a home environment because, you know, the same little stylet they use to pierce thrips and suck out their guts, they can also use to poke you too. Some people get irritated. They're very tiny, so you just feel like a little like pinch or whatever, but I think they're awesome. They're called minute pirate bug because they're black and white and they kind of look like a pirate flag. I don't know, lots of reasons to like them. All right, and oh, not quite there. So last resort, pesticides. you know, if you're going to go that route. Just make sure that you know what you're spraying. So spinosad-containing products such as Conserve do tend to work well on other species that are not western flower thrips. Like I mentioned, there are certain populations of western flower thrips that are resistant. So if you have sprayed a spinosad product on your plants and the thrips are still there and active and just as happy as they were a week later, then don't spray it anymore. You probably have western flower thrips or a population that's resistant to spinosad. Neonics are another option. They are systemic, which is one of the reasons why they work so well. So they kind of stay in the plant for a long period of time. So all of those successive generations of thrips also will die from coming into contact with it because they're actively feeding on the phloem where the pesticide is present. Neonics are not great if your plants are actively blooming and are outside. I will say that much. There's been a lot of research done on how neonics negatively affect bees, and we want to make sure bees stay healthy and happy. So, but on indoor plants, if you don't have pollinators around, you know, they can be a good method of control. There's just some considerations to keep in mind when using neonicotinoids. If you do a drench, please only do it once a year. There are a lot of resistance issues with neonicotinoids, and you really don't want to be developing your own like special population of resistant pests in your home by continually applying the same pesticide over and over again. What you want to do is you want to rotate. So that means, you know, if you have a pest population, say you drench with dinotefuran, which is a neonicotinoid, and you know, a month later the pest is still kind of around, maybe they are doing it so well, maybe then, as long as it's not western flower thrips, you spray with some spinosad or insecticidal soap or horticultural oil or Botanic Garden, or, you know, like the idea is to, as you're attacking your pest, using different methods, so that way it can't up its defenses time and time again. Horticultural oil, kind of meh on thrips, at least what I've seen. It will take out the larval stages, but it doesn't seem to really do a lot to the adults. Insecticidal soaps, again, like you get decent control with horticultural oil and insecticidal soaps. Those are probably things you need to apply, you know, once every 2 weeks for a month or two straight. And with that, you might run into issues with phytotoxicity. You know, if you apply those too often, then it can, you know, cause burning to the plant. So it's good to know specifically what type of plant you have and whether or not it can handle those sort of pesticide applications. Also, I want to know with insecticidal soap, it is totally worth it to invest in actual legitimate insecticidal soap and not just use your dish soap. You know, insecticidal soap is specifically formulated for applying to plants, so you have less, there's less chance of phytotoxicity with those products than using Dawn dish soap or something like that. You also want to make sure that you read the label, you know, especially if you're using a neonicotinoid or a spinosad or, you know, even horticultural oils and insecticidal soaps. Like, read the label, know what you're applying, because the label is the law. I'm a trained pesticide applicator. As homeowners, you aren't beholden to as many laws and regulations as I am, but it's still good to know, like, the label tells you all the potential dangers of that particular pesticide, and what potential protective equipment you might want to wear while applying it, which is important. Like with the Botanic Garden and things like that, you have to wear a respirator. With neonics, like you probably at least want to be wearing gloves. And labels also tell you what rate to use on your plants as well. Rates are really important because if you apply too little, then it's not going to work. If you apply too much, then you run the risk of having phytotoxicity. You also want to avoid some of the old school organophosphates, carbamates, and pyrethroids. These tend to be extremely toxic to humans. Pyrethroids, not so much. They're mostly just not great for the environment, but definitely organophosphates and carbamates. So those specifically acephate, malathion, carbryl, they are just, yeah, super toxic to humans. I try to avoid them at all costs in my line of work, and generally they just don't tend to work that well on thrips anymore because they were used for so long, and a lot of thrips populations have built up resistance to them. And, you know, it might kill off the thrips for a little while, but then they'll probably just come roaring back. But yeah, I think that's it. I think we're going to move on to questions, and I saw some questions popping up.
Chelsea, I've been setting them aside so I can read them off to you.
Okay.
Yeah, that might be. You don't have to filter through everything. And also, thank you so much for doing this. This was wonderful.
Yeah, no problem.
Okay, so are there species of thrips that are more destructive to aroids than others?
Honestly, if you have a thrips population on your plants, it's going to do damage no matter what the species is. Like if it's actively feeding on your plant, that means it's found a happy little home and it's made itself home there. So not to my knowledge. In general, Western flower thrips tend to be the biggest pest in the nursery trade. So you see them across all different species of plants, including aroids. I've definitely seen my fair share on anthuriums. They love anthurium flowers. They just hang out on there all day long. They're perfectly happy. But yeah, not one particular species or another. If I had to pick, it would probably be Western flower thrips.
Okay. Will this PowerPoint be available for the public to view later on? We will be recording this, so it'll be available in that way.
Yeah, I think I might be able to make it available offline. I just need to get permission from work to do that.
And in one of your previous slides, you showed silver coloration as a signifier that it was thrips. Is the silver coloration always present? And if so, is that because they are rupturing cells and destroying chloroplasts?
Kind of. So the silver coloration is more from the cuticle of the plant, cuticle of the leaf separating from the rest of the tissue of the leaf due to the feeding damage. And there's not always silver coloration. I can go back some slides. A lot of times you'll just have sometimes it'll be brown, sometimes it'll be silver. Other times, like on this plant, there's hardly any silver coloration. It's just mostly distortion and a little bit of necrosis and chlorosis. But yeah, so that's what makes thrips damage one of the trickier things to identify, because it can be so diverse in what it looks like.
Okay. Yeah. In one of these other slides, you showed a life cycle and mentioned that chili thrips had a different life cycle. How? And then you also said, I think you said there were 5,000 different kinds of thrips. Did I remember that correctly? So how divided are they between that? Like, is that the most common life cycle, or?
Yeah. So this tends to be the most common life cycle amongst the plant-feeding thrips species, especially those that are fairly major plant pests. The chili thrips is kind of an exception because they're so tiny. They just spend most of their lives on the surface of the leaf. So rather than having the pupa fall to the soil, the pupa just hang out in the leaves or in the buds until the adults emerge.
Okay. Would love to know more about their flying capability and whether they can target new host plants with flight.
So, kind of to some degree, it's tough because they mostly move on wind currents. So they have these fringe little wings. I'll go back to the first slide. That they just kind of open up and then allow themselves to drift off on a nice little wind. I think that they're able to kind of like a hang glider, kind of navigate through the air towards one particular area or another, which is probably how they navigate to, say, like thrips lures and other plants that they're particularly interested in. Mm-hmm. So if you have a lot of air movement, then you get more movement of thrips. But again, like if your plants are close to each other, they can simply just like crawl from one plant to another.
And during their stage when they're in the ground, do they eat the roots?
No, they don't. So they're mostly immobile when they're in the soil, and they mostly just hang out on the top of the soil. Like I mentioned before, they just kind of like fall to the soil surface. So they're this little pupa, kind of like a cocoon to some degree, like with caterpillars. So they're just kind of immobile, going through their metamorphosis into adults. So they're just hanging out in the soil, not really doing much. So I did forget to mention that certain soil applications, so you could do a soil application of some of those biopesticides, and that would target those soil life stages. Unfortunately, it wouldn't target any of the above ground stages that are still on the plant, but it would at least kill the pupa that are in the soil.
And got a couple questions about neem oil. Wondering about how neem affects thrips, and would watering with neem so the plants and roots absorb the neem be beneficial?
So neem oil, so typically neem oil doesn't actually have the active ingredient azadirachtin in it, which is what you actually want from the neem tree. So azadirachtin is a chemical that was originally discovered in the neem tree, and that is an insecticide that works fairly well. They aren't quite sure of its mode of action, but they think it's kind of like an insect growth regulator to some degree, so it affects like how they molt or reproduce. And unfortunately, the sort of neem oil that you would buy in a plant shop or online or something like that doesn't actually have azadirachtin in it. It's mostly just oil. So it's just another type of horticultural oil. So it could potentially help treat, suffocate the pupa that are on the surface of the soil, but I don't think drenching it would really do anything systemically. If you were to get an azadirachtin product, then you might see a little bit more residual effect with that.
So neem is something, but not everything.
So neem oil is just as good as like horticultural oil. So it acts by suffocation. So insects have these little breathing holes on the side of their bodies. They don't breathe through their mouths like you and I do. They have these little breathing holes called spiracles on the sides of their bodies. And so oil acts by completely surrounding and suffocating the insect, kind of like putting a giant wet blanket on the top of it to some degree. So that works really well with certain life stages. I haven't seen great efficacy on adults with using oils, but you know, it works fairly well on like the larval stages. So I'm not saying to just throw your neem oil out, but unless you could look at the label, and unless it says contains azadirachtin and has like azadirachtin and like a percentage on it, it's not doing much else than say like ultra fine or ultra pure oil is. It's not doing much else.
Good to know. Are thrips more active at specific times of day or night?
Good question. I'm pretty sure they're diurnal, so they're not nocturnal. But yeah, I think they feed mostly just kind of throughout the day when it's bright outside. They, like I had mentioned with their life cycle, you know, they speed up when it's warmer, so you'll see them moving faster and being more active when it's warm versus when it's cold. So that might have effect on, you know, time of day as well. Typically, you know, it's warmer during the day and cooler at night. But in general, I don't think they're very active at night.
You mentioned a pheromone. Do you have one that you use or find works well?
Yeah, so I think BioLine has Thrips lure. Let me see if I can find it. BioLine is there are a lot of good companies out there when it comes to biological insects. I might have to get back to you on that. I'm trying to remember who I sourced it from Griffin, but they're a greenhouse supply company that sourced it from another company. So
okay, cool. And do Swarovski work well to control thrips?
Swarovski, yeah. They're a little bit better on whitefly, but they will. I mean, they'll probably eat the nymphs and things like that. I know that more research has been done on Amblyceus cucumeris. That was the species I talked about, right? Yeah, cucumeris. More research has been done with cucumeris, and it's, you know, shown efficacy, whereas Swarovski, kind of hit or miss. Possibly with some of the smaller thrips species, you might see more efficacy with Swarovski, because I know Swarovski also feeds on broad mites as well. So, you know, possibly with chili thrips, you might see Swarovski working well with those, since chili thrips also kind of hide out in the buds of plants.
On one of your slides, you mentioned don't use with mites. I think it was the systemic.
Oh, did I not mention that? Yeah, okay. So one of the things about neonics, especially imidacloprid, has been shown to increase the fecundity, so the amount of eggs that a particular mite will lay, of spider mites. So if you have spider mites, don't use imidacloprid. Not good. And so imidacloprid and dinotefuran are in the same chemical class of, they're both neonicotinoids. So, dinotefuran in particular has shown pretty good efficacy against thrips. I would just be careful if you have spider mites on your plants and you're using neonicotinoids, just make sure to also address the spider mites separately. Otherwise, you could have a spider mite outbreak on your hands, which wouldn't be good.
On that same note, is imidacloprid bonide systemic a neonic?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, it is. Yeah. And neonics, like I mentioned, they work. But if you have children or pets that like to eat your potting soil, I probably wouldn't recommend them because, especially if you're drenching them, they stick around for a long period of time. It's hanging out. Neonics in general tend to have a fairly low toxicity to humans, but there has been, some concern about human health in relation to exposure to neonicotinoids. So just be careful if you have kids and pets around.
Okay. What do you do if you have thrips, but also have insects that could be predating them outdoors? Is it just a waiting game at that point?
Yeah. So it's keeping an eye on the population. So if it seems like the thrips are winning the war, that is one of the usefulness is one of the useful purposes of neonicotinoids and doing systemic drenches, because if it's being absorbed through the plant roots, then only the insects that are actively feeding on the plant will be exposed to that pesticide. So neonics can be used in combination with beneficial insects as long as you don't also have pollinators who might be feeding on flowers or something like that. Because the predaceous insects will be feeding on the insects, and the insects will be feeding on the plants, and the insects that are feeding on the plants will die. So,
yeah. Okay. What about safer insecticidal soap? I've been trying to use this to get rid of my thrips.
Yeah, so that's a good insecticidal soap. Again, just if you have the diluted form, that's great. It's already, mixed to the rate that you're supposed to be using it at. But you want to keep in mind the thrips life cycle, right? So an adult is alive for around a month or so. And each generation, each stage of the thrips life cycle, depending on how warm it is, lasts a day or two or three. So that adult is laying eggs the whole time it's an adult, right? So it's laying eggs for about 20 days straight. So you can have multiple larvae coming, right one after another. So the adult lays an egg, lays a few eggs one week, lays a few eggs the next week. So you have successive generations of larvae hatching. So it's good to keep in mind that you need to treat those successive stages of larvae, that you can't just treat the plant once and then it's all good. You probably have to because the larvae are more susceptible to the soap than the adults are. The adults are very hard to kill. They're just in general. That's one of the reasons why they're such a big pest. So the best way to get rid of them is to just constantly kill all the larvae, make sure that they can never make it back to the adult stage, which is why you want to do successive applications of the pesticide so that you can just kill them off before they're able to, go full circle back to being an adult and laying eggs again. Does that make sense?
It makes sense, and it's fascinating. There's so much to know just in this one chart right here. Do thrips avoid any particular plants?
Avoid.
Mm-hmm.
There are certain plants that are thrips traps. So they're the species are escaping my mind right now, but they tend to have very um, sticky leaf surfaces, so they exude a lot from their leaf hairs, and that will actually trap the thrips just like a sticky card would,
Mm-hmm.
which is pretty fascinating. I wouldn't say that there are any that thrips actively avoid. I feel like I've seen thrips on just about every plant.
Okay, cool. So I just saw somebody ask, and I think it's relevant. Is that like Drosera or what's the second one? Pingicula? Would that be examples of the like the sticky plants that you were mentioning? Would that be like a Drosera or a Pingicula?
um, oh, are you talking about like sundews and things
Yeah.
like that?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, those will definitely eat thrips for sure. I use eat loosely, slowly, like um, make them dissolve and absorb their nutrients. They will, but there are other plants that are not carnivorous that the thrips just simply get stuck on their leaves, and the
Oh,
plant doesn't necessarily benefit from it besides the fact that the thrips isn't able to feed on it.
huh.
Yeah.
Interesting.
I
Still got.
think it's in the Lamiaceae family. I'll try to figure out the name of it. I can always post it on the Facebook group too.
That would be great. You could also maybe include the pheromone
Sure.
no more. So we've still got a couple questions, and they seem to still be coming in. If I have found the little white ones on the back of leaves, are those larvae, pupa, or just baby adults? They move when you push them. And follow up, if I haven't seen any adults and I have only seen those on two houseplants, which used to be next to each other in a room, am I already infested?
Okay. First question. Those are probably larvae if they're on the undersides of the leaves, and they're small and white. Typically, adults have a little bit more coloration to them. I'm not positive that they're thrips that you're speaking of. Um, there are so many different pests out there, but if they're, long and cylindrical, then they're probably thrips larvae. What was the second part of that question?
It was if I haven't seen any adults and I have them and I have only seen these on two houseplants which used to be next to each other, am I already infested?
I would say just keep those plants separate from the rest of your plants, and try to treat them. Sounds like if they're still just in the larval stage, that you'd probably have some success with insecticidal soap or horticultural oil. And if you're not seeing a lot, then this would be the time to treat them. Like I mentioned before, it's once you have a lot on your plants, then it's much more difficult to take care of them.
Yeah. Are systemics effective against thrips? And you tend to mix systemics into soil, but is there a product that could be used in a soilless medium like leca?
So systemics you can spray foliarly. Typically, as long as it's not the like granular form that's only meant for applying to soil. They do make systemics that you can spray on your plant. And yes, systemics do tend to work. Neonics in general are pretty safe for humans, at least. Taking into all the other considerations I had mentioned about neonics. Making sure that your plant isn't also infested with mites. If you're looking for a specific like liquid systemic to spray on your plants, look for something with the active ingredient dinotefuran. This in particular works fairly well on thrips. Other systemics can be kind of hit or miss.
Okay. Am I wasting my time by treating the leaves manually with 70% rubbing alcohol?
Depends on if there are actually pests that you see that you are actively killing with that process. I had mentioned briefly that the eggs are, maybe I mentioned it? I hope I mentioned it. So the eggs are deposited into the plant tissue. So this makes it really difficult to get rid of this part of the life cycle because it's just hiding out in the leaf or the stem or whatever, and then out pops the larva and then it starts feeding. So you can't really wipe away the eggs. You might be wiping away like the larval stages and the adult stages, and especially if there are adults that you're killing, you're probably doing some good because the adults can lay up to 200 eggs in their lifetime. So each adult that you're getting rid of, you're preventing an exponential increase in the infestation. But at the same time, you're probably not getting all the pests. So this is something you might have to do indefinitely if that's your only mode of control. Sorry to say.
So as for bonine systemic applications, if I have applied them in the past, not in the last 2 months, how long would it be, if not at all, before it's safe to put them outside for the summer? If not, is there a systemic for houseplant use that is safe for when the plants go outside?
So typically, if the plant's not flowering, then it's fine to go outside. Neonics are mostly just a concern for pollinators, and so if your plant's not flowering, the pollinator is not gonna give them more leaves on the ground. Like there's benefits me in no way. I'm not gonna waste my time on it. But if it is actively flowering, then I probably would wait a little while to put it outside. 2 months is definitely a good amount of time to let pass. But I would probably err closer to like 3 or 4 months personally. But I think that there are on most neonic labels, they say that they're pollinator safe after 30 days. So you're probably fine if it's been 2 months.
Okay.
Was there another part of that question that I didn't answer?
Is there a systemic for houseplant use that is safe after a few months that can go outside? I think you just answered it.
Yeah. As long as it's not flowering, you're good.
Okay, that's good to know. I didn't know that one. How often would you recommend rotating insecticidal soap or oil to avoid resistance?
So the great thing about insecticidal soap and port oil is that because their modes of action are very physical, so with oil, it is suffocating the insect, and with soap, it is basically like drying them out. So it breaks up their waxy cuticle and causes them to basically like dry up and desiccate. Because the mode of action isn't something like, oh, it's this, enzyme that affects something in their gut, which causes them to die. There isn't really much concern over resistance building with those two particular insecticides, soaps and oils. It's mostly when you're talking about neonicotinoids, which affect the central nervous system of the insect, or spinoscids, which affect their gut and their feeding, that insects are able to kind of evolve methods of getting rid of those toxins. Whereas soaps and oils, they aren't toxins to the plant. They're just, or to the insect. They're just simply like, if we were to squish an insect with our fingers, there's not really a way for an insect to develop resistance to us squishing them.
All right. And could you use a plant trap species like Pincocula or Drosera to combat an infestation of thrips?
That is an interesting question. I don't know. I'm not. So I would say probably not, because I don't know if thrips would be particularly attracted to either of those plants. Maybe if you also like put a thrips lure in one of those plants, like in the pot or something, then you might be able to get the thrips to come to it. And I mostly say that because we do have a greenhouse at the Botanic Gardens that have plenty of carnivorous plants. And it was one of our hardest hit houses for thrips infestation this past spring. And they weren't feeding on their carnivorous plants, they were feeding on other crops in that greenhouse, but they were still there, just perfectly happy staying on their plants, you know, on the other plants that weren't trying to digest them.
Steering clear. In the cannabis industry, they treat plants with silicone for nourishment, but it also has the latent effect of hardening cellular walls and structures of the plants. Would you recommend this with arrowheads?
Sure. Yeah, I've done some research on silicone. You can also add it to your fertilizers as well. I don't know if you guys know the little like silicone packets that you always get in like your shoes or, you know, bags of seaweed or other things, like the desiccants, basically the silicone desiccants. You can actually dissolve those in water and use them as a fertilizer.
Interesting.
Yeah, and it has the same benefits as the foliar applications of silicone.
Huh. Can thrips survive in a soilless medium like lechuza or leca?
Yeah. So they're feeding on the plants, so they aren't really, you know, they're feeding on the leaves of the plants. They aren't. All they're doing in the soil is just hanging out. So whether or not it's soil or something artificial, if there's a place for them to kind of rest for a period of time, then, you know, they'll still, you know, be able to reproduce and carry on their life cycle. Even in hydroponic greenhouses, thrips are still a problem, even if there's, you know, no soil whatsoever, even soilless media. And that's because the pupa are just pupating on the ground, especially if there's not good sanitation, or they're just pupating on the leaves and, you know, not all of them are falling to the ground.
That's interesting. Can you see where they hatch from? Like, is there recognizable damage on the leaf?
You would probably need a microscope to see it. It's so tiny. I mean, already, you know, we're talking about a millimeter for the most mature, largest stage of the adult. So think of an egg coming out of the end of that body. I think it's pretty tiny. And the egg itself doesn't really do much damage. It's mostly the larva and the adults and their feeding that do most of the damage.
And mentioning the microscope, would you be able to post the one that you said you recommend, that visor one?
Oh yeah, it's I mean, if you just look for a magnification visor, there are lots of different ones out there.
Okay.
Jewelers use them a lot, and you can look at, typically it'll say what magnification it is. You know, you probably want at least 2x, but the more magnification that you have, the closer up you'll be able to see things, you know, in more detail.
Okay. We've still got a couple more questions. If I saw tiny yellow moving things and wipe with soap and alcohol, as someone previously mentioned, but they don't appear anymore, was that thrips?
Possibly. Yeah, especially if they were kind of long and cylindrical. Probably thrips, but just, continue keeping an eye on them, on your plants. Make sure they don't come back.
Okay. Right. And speaking of silica or silicone, could watering with diatomaceous earth into the soil be dually beneficial, offering boosted silica content and damaging pupa when the diatomaceous earth is dry?
Yeah, definitely.
Huh. Interesting. All right. Great. Well, if there's no other, or are there any other questions? All right, we've got one more. Also, do you have a favorite systemic that is good for both thrips and spider mites?
Ooh, spider mites are hard to control with systemics. They are fairly easy to control with oil. So if you just kind of stay on top of doing, combine oil applications with systemic applications, if you're also battling thrips, that, would probably be the best route. But yeah, the way that mites feed, they don't really get down into the phloem as much, so it's harder to target them with systemics.
Plus, they increase the fecundity of spider mites?
Yeah, so neonics in particular do. There are lots of other chemical classes out there nowadays and others that have systemic action, but I'm not sure how widely available to the home consumer they are. They're more like for greenhouse industry use.
All right. So great. Well, if there's no other questions, thank you everyone for joining. Keep an eye open and we'll be sending this recording out with the link to the posting after today's call. Thank you again, Chelsea McKinley, for doing this. This was wonderful. Everyone, you will be receiving a short survey about the lecture. Please take a moment to fill this out. It helps us better understand events for everyone. Also, please be on the lookout for future events with Arrowwoods Indoors, like our upcoming July happy hour, as well as future lectures. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks. Bye.